And do you have a particular area of interest that you focus on?
I focus on children and families. I'm concerned with social inequality, and I use I use demographic research methods to study families around the world.
Tell me a little bit about the topic that you and your colleagues had some interest in discipline, not only here in the United States, but comparatively around the world. Can you tell me a little bit about why the interest?
So raising children, as all parents know, is very difficult. And sometimes children misbehave, and parents have to decide what they're going to do when children misbehave. And one of the most common ways that parents discipline their children is through spanking. And culturally, there is a lot of debate about whether spanking is good or bad for kids, so it's a very important topic for research.
You said culturally there's a lot of debate. Let's start by talking about the United States. Where are we now in terms of how parents feel about spanking?
There's been a lot of research over the past several decades, and this research is clear from the United States and other high-income countries that spanking is harmful to kids. And so spanking, it's not as popular as it used to be, but it's still quite common. But we actually don't know as much about what's going on with spanking in places outside of the United States, places like low and middle income countries. And so for this project, that's something that we were particularly interested in, is trying to understand spanking in places outside of high-income countries.
Tell me a little bit about how you went about gathering your data.
These surveys collect data about the health and well-being of women and children in low and middle income countries. And it's a massive feat. They've been collected in over 100 countries since 1995. And what makes them so useful is they're population-based, and so we can generalize our findings within a given country, often for the entire country. And the questions are often standardized across countries, which allows us to use data from many places in the world and look at it at once. And so for our study, we were looking at data from 62 countries. We had approximately 215,000 children in our sample. The children were ages 3 and 4, and what we did is we looked at the relationship between spanking in the household and child well-being as reported by the mother. And we were also able to account for a set of socio-demographic characteristics of the family, such as their level of wealth and the mother's education. And something that's important to keep in mind about our analysis is that we only are able to observe children at one time point. The data were collected between 2009 and 2017. So we have a pretty broad range of time, but we only see each child once.
What did you determine after looking at this massive amount of data?
What we found was that spanking was associated with lower child well-being. And this was an important finding, but it gets more interesting. When we broke it down by country, we found remarkable consistency in the relationship between spanking and child well-being. So in 59 countries, there was a clear negative relationship where spanking looked bad. In 3 countries, there was less certainty, but it was also negative.
When you're breaking it down, when you're looking at this relationship between spanking and lower child well-being, what kind of problems are associated?
This includes aggression, things like biting, hitting other kids, kicking other kids. It includes getting along well with other kids, and also attention.
Why is that concerning?
I mean, it relates to things like ADHD, something that a lot of people are thinking about. And so I think our findings are what's mostly going on is aggression. That's like one of the most consistent findings about spanking, but it also relates to things like, inattention.
I was just wondering if you had made the link between these behaviors and some other outcomes.
What we were doing is we were looking at it together, and we wanted to know, on average, across all these types of behaviors or indicators of well-being of children, what's going on. So we didn't really, for our specific study, we didn't break it down by specific behavior.
What are the implications?
The main implication is that spanking appears to be harmful on a global scale, and at best, spanking is ineffective but usually it appears to be harmful to kids. And so an implication of this is that, spanking appears to be ineffective, no matter where it happens.
Do you have any suggestions or any parent behaviors or behavioral changes that you could suggest?
Based solely on our study, the main implication is for parents to consider not spanking their kids. But then, as you said, what next? If you maybe shouldn't spank your kid, then what's something else that you can do? I think the most important thing for parents is to establish a healthy relationship with their children. Talking with them and listening to them is important. Showing them that you love them and value their opinions and enjoy spending time with them. And also keeping in mind their developmental level. Our expectations for children need to be based on where they're at. So, our expectations for a 1-year-old are very different from a 6 or 7-year-old.
Are you able to speak to any kinds of guidelines that you can give parents when they're in the heat of the moment?
Well, I think it's absolutely appropriate to help the child to understand, the seriousness of the situation, whatever it is. Absolutely talk with them and help them see how frightened or upset you might be. But then also talk with them about it and help them understand. Now, depending on how old they are, that conversation, that experience is going to look different. And every child is different. There's not a one-size-fits-all approach to parenting, but there are a lot of ways that parents can engage in a positive way with their children to foster their development.
From your experience and from your research, did you find that there was more cultural acceptance of spanking in other parts of the world?
Absolutely, and this is a big debate among researchers about the cultural normativeness of spanking. In some places, spanking is not very common at all. In some places, almost all children are spanked.
Would you be able to give me some countries where it's more the norm and some countries where it's less accepted from your research?
There are some places that, such as like the Nordic countries, which back in like the 70s and 80s really showed concern for spanking, and it started to go down over there. And then in some places it's still very common, maybe in places like sub-Saharan Africa. At the same time, countries around the world, not just Nordic countries, are quite concerned about spanking and feel like the research is compelling. There's actually 54 countries around the world that have banned spanking legally, both at school and in the home. And they're really drawing from a human rights perspective. So adults have a right not to be hit, but children typically don't have the right not to be hit. But many countries, regardless of how common it is, have started to actually ban spanking and would like to see that prevalence go down.
What would be the challenge in having a ban like that in the United States?
Well, we have some very strong cultural norms around spanking here. And there's a lot to be said about parents' rights. Parents in the United States especially don't want to be told how to parent their children. And spanking is quite common in some places in the United States. So I think that there are actually some places in the United States that have thought about potentially making it illegal. But as of now, that's not really the case. It may happen someday, but I would guess that it wouldn't happen for some time.
What would be the next logical step for you and your colleagues in terms of research from the information that you've gleaned from this study?
Well, our study, strengthens the empirical evidence that spanking is harmful to children. And so the next step is, if it is harmful, then how can we reduce the prevalence of spanking, both in the United States and around the world? Something that I'm very interested in doing is trying to understand efforts to reduce spanking. One of those efforts includes the legal bans. And there are other types of interventions that aren't in the legal system that aim to reduce spanking. So understanding what makes those interventions or policies effective is something that we're working on.
If you could tell me where you got your undergraduate degree and graduate degree and where you are now in terms of your studies.
I received my bachelor's degree in social work from Brigham Young University, Idaho, and I received my master's degree in social work from Brigham Young University. I'm currently a doctoral student at the University of Michigan. I'm studying social work and sociology.
Have you done any studies specifically on spanking in the United States?
Yeah, I've used data from the Fragile Family Study to study spanking. That's ongoing.
What kind of negative impacts in the United States have you seen on kids?
It definitely relates to aggression. And so we can expect that when children are spanked, as young children, we're going to expect increases in aggressive behavior, and not necessarily drawing from my own research, but typically what happens is that we get immediate compliance when we spank kids, and it makes it feel like the spanking is effective because the behavior stops for a little bit. But then often what happens is that the behavior returns relatively quickly, and in the long term, behavior gets worse.
You said spanking was related to lower child well-being. Was how much lower, or were there percentages?
Yeah, I can give you some percentages. So if we were to say that 0% is the lowest child well-being we can measure, and 100% is the highest child well-being that we can measure, we expect to see a 3 percentage point decrease, or we expect to see 3 percentage points lower child well-being overall. But when we break it down by country, it's that range is there's a broader range, and so in the places where the association is the strongest, we'd expect to see 6 percentage points lower child well-being.
Those don't sound like huge numbers, but you're talking about a large number of children, right? When you're talking about percentage.
That's right. So typically the effects of spanking can be quite small, but when we're looking at the population level, if we can identify something that in a certain country could potentially help increase child well-being by 6 percentage points, we probably want to do that. And so in this case, spanking is one of those things. It's not the only thing that matters for child development. There's many things that parents do and societies do to promote child development. But this is one of those things, and it's important.
When you're talking about spanking, there's different degrees. Did you guys quantify? Was it spanking with an open hand, spanking with a paddle or a board? Did you guys look at different degrees or length of time?
There's different ways that the survey measures spanking. Well, I should say there are different ways that the survey measures corporal punishment. And so one of those ways is spanking. And it is a yes or no question: was a particular child in the household spanked in the past month? And that's translated in slightly different ways across the countries, but the meaning behind it is roughly the same. So we're not able to get too much information about how often or intense it was. We just know whether there was some spanking that happened in the past month.